Tom Clark's 6M podcast is a Boink Studios production. And now, on with the show. Hey, what is up? Welcome to Tom Clark's 6M podcast. I'm your host, Tom Clark, and in this episode, I'm joined by co-host Phil Lindsey.
Rock and roll is here to stay. You know how many years they said that? You know how many songs that have been written that included that lyric? That song title itself, rock and roll is here to stay. It's never going away. Rock and roll will never die, right? Well, these days, kids, you can count on one hand the number of true rock and roll bands that are out there making it big time. I'm not saying making it at all. Maybe your favorite band in your local hometown that you go to see every Saturday night crushes it. How do I know? I'm talking about making it. I'm talking about worldwide, Metallica level making it. I mean, I don't know how many is left. I guess the Stones, you can still say. And I'm not going to sit here and go through the range of bands that may or may not still be out there. Just a couple of examples, kids, you know. But man, once upon a time, it was believed rock and roll is here to stay. It's never going anywhere. And look, to be fair, rock and roll was probably, the genre itself is not that old. If you want to be technical about it, when you talk about going back to 1920s, 1930s, old bluesmen, and it became rock and roll, dude, it's not that far. It's not that far back. I mean, in terms of music, in terms of the popularity of it, we're talking the 50s and 60s. Honestly, is when it really, really exploded. So no, it's not really been that long ago, to be fair. But one of the guys we're talking about here today, who has been described as one of the pioneers of rock and roll, and rightfully so, somebody that I don't know if we've ever really mentioned him here on the 6M before, but man, does he deserve to be talked about, because he is, for lack of a better word, he's a king, or possibly a queen. I think he'd get a kick out of that, actually. But it's Little Richard, man. And during an era of rock and roll when albums weren't really all that important, it was more about the band or about the singer and about the songs. It was about the hits, about the singles. And the idea of the albums didn't really become a thing until later. I don't know if anybody that could name a Little Richard album, but buddy, they can name the songs. They can name the hits. And man, did he have a lot of them. Took him a long time to get his props, to get his flowers, and he finally got them towards the end of his life, which is ridiculous. But we'll get into that here today, and also into the genius that was Little Richard. Let's get into it. Richard Wayne Penniman, born December 5th, 1932, and passed on May 9th, 2020. Known professionally, of course, as Little Richard, was an American singer, pianist, and songwriter. He was an influential figure in popular music and culture for 7 decades. Do the math, kids. That's a long time. Described as the architect of rock and roll, Richard's most celebrated work dates from the mid-1950s, when his charismatic showmanship and dynamic music, characterized by frenetic piano playing, pounding black beat, and powerful, raspy vocals, laid the foundation for rock and roll. Richard's innovative, emotive vocalizations and up-tempo rhythmic music played a key role in the formation of other popular music genres, including soul and funk. Can I get an amen from the congregation? He influenced singers and musicians across musical genres, from rock, yes, to hip-hop, absolutely. His music helped shape rhythm and blues for generations, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. But that is your lowdown on Little Richard. So, Phil, even as a kid, when Little Richard was still alive and still going, as a kid, Little Richard seemed old to me. Of course, when you're a kid, everybody seems old, right? But he was sort of in that class of, well, these are old timers or whatever. But even in the mid to late 70s into the 80s, he was still a popular figure, still an icon for all the right reasons and for some wrong reasons, let's be fair. But what kind of connection do you have to Little Richard's music? Did you hear it growing up? Was your family listening to it? Was it a part of your existence, or did you come to it later?
I didn't hear a lot of his music growing up, but it was one of those things, I think all of us remembers the first time we've seen Little Richard, and I think seeing him is different than just hearing his music. because I think that's a big part of what made Richard, like his not just his music, but just who he was as a performer.
100% stage presence. I mean, he set the tone for acts that came afterward. Dude, you could argue that Elton John wouldn't be Elton John without Little Richard. You could argue that Prince wouldn't have been Prince without Little Richard. Michael Jackson. I mean, dude, there wouldn't have been a James Brown without Little Richard. There's a direct connection with James Brown and Little Richard, which is awesome. I mean, dude, how many people influenced by this guy? I mean, that's the true test of a legend, right? Of how influential you are is how many acts exist because of you in the first place, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the amount of guys that he directly influenced, and he made sure to let you know that he directly influenced you every time he got a chance. And the people that I'm sure influenced him that never got to tell him that is just vast.
Yeah, he spent a lot of his time, like you said, reminding people of the acts that he influenced, because honestly, he didn't get many flowers when he was alive. Never won a Grammy. I mean, I don't know how that happens, but the dude never won a Grammy, which is mind-blowing. Of course, there's a lot of amazing acts out there that weren't given their just due, but I don't know of any of them but that were left out in the cold as much as Little Richard was. And it wasn't, again, toward the end that he finally got his respect. A few different reasons for that. One was that he did walk away from the business at one point. He walked away a couple of times, actually, to pursue a life in the ministry, to work in the church. And he was serious about it. But the record deal that he had signed, basically he didn't own the publishing rights to anything that he had recorded, and they cut him out. So when he left, he was done. So he didn't get any money from any of that, which is effing ridiculous. So that hurt him. And then, of course, the fact that he's a black man performing during the time that he was probably didn't help him too awful much. And also the fact that he was gay as well. And I'm guessing bisexual perhaps too, I would say, yeah. These things didn't help him, man. I mean, you could almost make the argument, Phil, that was he here during the right time? Do you know what I mean? Like, things were that much harder for him because of those factors, right?
Yeah, I definitely think not just in terms of his music, he was ahead of his time, but just everything he represented at that time. He was out and openly gay at a time where there just weren't a lot of artists, let alone a lot of black artists that were doing the same thing.
And plus, born in Macon, Georgia. We talked a little bit about this off mic today.
Yes. Deep South. He was born in the Deep South, pre-civil rights era. In the 30s, it just was a different time. And I'm sure with not just how much religion is indoctrinated into the black community, but at that time in the Deep South, just how much religion was a thing, I'm sure it was very difficult for him. Yeah, for sure. And, it's one of those things, again, man, the combination of the timing, the era, the location, his circumstances. He grew up very poor, the third of 12 children. Wow.
Whew. His father was a church deacon and a brick mason who sold bootleg moonshine on the side and owned a nightclub. So, yeah, I mean, his dad was a church deacon, for crying out loud. But, yeah, I mean, growing up with nothing and having dreams and having aspirations of becoming something else. I mean, there's stories of him growing up and being, maybe feminine's the right word, perhaps. But, showing signs very early on that he's, for lack of a better word, different maybe. But all that plays in. And man, as much as he struggled with his identity after he, became famous, became a performer and everything, when he's on stage and he's in interviews, he is unapologetically himself. He's brutally honest with the audience. He never pulls any punches. And he says exactly what he's thinking. He's entertaining. He's charismatic. Dude, there'll absolutely never be another Little Richard, man. He was definitely one of a kind.
Yes, he was a character, and I think to your point when you said earlier, nobody can name a Little Richard album, but I'm sure you can you can name a moment where you saw him for the first time and how it impacted you, whether it be an interview, a performance, some kind of random cameo, and all of the stuff that he started showing up in the late 90s. Yeah, it was just hard to escape him at some point, like especially when he finally started getting the flowers.
Oh, for sure. And like you mentioned things that people that you could see him in, that people could see him in. I mean, at the time they were churning out terrible rock and roll movies one after the other, and they were all pretty highly forgettable, except for The Girl Can't Help It. Like that was a hit. He was featured on the soundtrack and in the movie. And by the way, chosen over Fats Domino, which was quite the accomplishment at a time when not a lot of people knew who Richard was, and that movie helped put him on the map. That movie stands out as being one of the exceptions to the rule of a crappy rock and roll movie. So, but yeah, he's, again, like you said, the first time you see him, the stage presence, I mean, you could say he was a combination of Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis put together and then some. And, the guy was just, God, he was magnetic. He was on fire. Arrested so many times for like public lewdness because he would take his clothes off on stage because he was so into the performance, which is freaking nuts. But he was just himself, man. Like I said, he just unapologetically himself. He passed away in Tullahoma, Tennessee. And as we said, rock and roll, rhythm and blues, gospel, soul. Dude, that the dichotomy of his gospel roots, of his upbringing, being born and raised in church and being told that basically all gay people are going to hell. And if you do those things, you're an abomination in the eyes of God. They still believe that too, Phil, by the way there. But that you're doomed to burn forever. And then he's got that side of himself, but he's also wanting to remain faithful. The inner turmoil this guy must have gone through in his career was probably crazy.
Yeah, for sure. Because I don't understand what it's like to be a gay man, but I do understand in some ways what it's like to, just want to be yourself. And it has to be very hard, not just to deal with racism, but also deal with homophobia at the same time. And like, at least when you're dealing with racism, your family and everything around you understands and they can be there for you. But if your family is also deeply religious and they're not going to accept you because of, your sexuality or the way you look. I think he also had like a deformity that his father was ashamed of or something like that. It had to be really difficult, man. It had to be difficult to find somewhere where he felt he belonged.
Yeah, he had one of his arms was shorter than the other and one of his legs was shorter than the other, which is crazy. Yeah, that's true. And all this, kids, basically starts in October of 47 when he was discovered at age 14, by the way, by Sister Rosetta Thorpe. And if you don't know about Sister Rosetta, let me tell you something. It's if you don't know, it might be a shock to the system, kids, to see an African-American woman shredding guitar in 1947. But dude, absolutely a freaking icon and a classic in this field and music in general. But she discovers him and hears him singing during this performance and then wants him to open the show for him. And it's the first time he got paid and it made him want to become a performer. I mean, they feel there's a whole subset of rock and roll before Elvis, like pre-Elvis, that not a lot of people to this day, I think, even realize. And dude, the farther we get from that era, the more I'm afraid that we're going to forget or that it's not going to be recorded for the sake of, history, I guess. But rock and roll, before it was called rock and roll, existed long before Elvis got here, man.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think along with just who he was and the larger than life character he was, you got to give the guy his credit for being an innovator. When they talked about not just his performance style, his music style, how he played the piano, just everything he brought to music, man, it's just, he deserves all the credit in the world for that. Again, it's crazy that it took so long, but again, talking about that time period in America and how a large part of the country wanted black music, but they didn't want black people. And then you also got this black man that is like eccentric and homosexual and all these other things that go along with it. Yeah, it was tough.
Yeah. Things working against him, man. Like you could argue he was behind the 8 ball from the jump, right? Hey, Tom Clark here for Tom Clark's Main Event. And if you are not subscribed, you're doing life wrong. Going strong since 2014 with over 300 episodes and a variety of guests that include Randy Orton, The Big Show, Rob Van Dam, and a lot more. Check us out on all the major platforms, including YouTube at Boink Studios. Subscribe today, Tom Clark's Main Event. If he had been a white guy growing up in New York with these dreams, his path to stardom would probably, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. He got there regardless, Phil, but I doubt it would have been wrought with so many problems as he faced on his rise to the top, honestly.
Oh, definitely. I think if he was white or he was doing something else, it would have been much easier for him. But I guess somebody always has to come in and break the mold. Somebody always has to be that guy to be different and inspire other people.
And it should be noted, kids, a lot of the stuff that Little Richard was singing about when he really broke in and really throughout his career were adapted from other songs. Like the original version of Tutti Frutti is nothing you'd ever play on the radio. Like at all. So if you know that version, Phil, you know it's the song's about anal sex and it doesn't hold back. So
I did not know that until recently. And so it's like, oh, okay, that's a thing. But yeah, when you hear the original version, it's like, okay, that is what it's about.
Yeah, as legend has it, Richard, I think during his first ever recording session, is in the studio for all day and it's not working. What they want him to sing, it's not working. He's not feeling it, it's not working. So they take a break, they go to this bar across the street and there's a piano in there. And of course, he's right at home behind the piano and he starts singing Tutti Frutti. And the record producer, I believe, is with him, white guy, hears the song and says, "You're recording this. This is a hit." And Richard's like, "I can't record this, man. This is, are you listening to the lyrics? I can't record this." And he's like, "Don't worry about it. We'll change them up." And so it's his first hit, Phil. I mean, without the benefit of, well, let's take a break. I need to unwind and try to figure out what I'm going to do here. And then he sits in front of that piano and then history's made. I mean, otherwise that song may not be recorded. That's crazy how that works in rock and roll, dude.
Yeah. And this is a massive record, covered to death. A lot of people other than Richard made money off of it. A lot of other people other than Richard got acclaim from it. And to think that almost was never recorded.
Crazy, isn't it?
Yeah. Definitely would have changed the face of rock music if that song was never recorded.
For sure. And talk about people that made money off of him. We'll have to take a moment to acknowledge the anti-Richard, also known as Pat Boone. If you don't know Pat Boone, kids, you're not missing a whole lot. Just imagine like a loaf of white bread. Hey, brother, I'm white. You've met me. But I know white bread when I see it. He's one of those guys that everything he sang, he pronounced every single word, and just that typical, like Dave Chappelle doing the voice of a white guy voice. But that was how he sang. So whenever a black man had a hit, Pat Boone covered it, and it's god awful. Go listen to Pat Boone's Tutti Frutti. Yeah. It is a crime against nature, Phil. Ooh. Crime against nature. Richard claims that Pat Boone made more money off his music than he did.
That is a travesty, if true.
Yeah.
Complete and utter travesty.
For sure. I mean, it got to the point where, as legend has it again, that they started speeding up the songs. They sped them up to the point where Pat Boone could not keep up with the timing of the song when he covered it. So if you hear his version, by the way, yes, he covered Long Tall Sally. If you hear him doing that song, he can't get the words out because he can't sing that fast. He can't keep tempo. I mean, it's, God. Yeah. Well, again, we're not going to play any clips. I don't want to get the show pulled down. And if I had them, I wouldn't play them anyway. It's that bad.
Yeah, definitely some unfortunate things like that happening for Richard, where he came in and did something incredible. And then, of course, some record exec somewhere was like, that's a money-making hit. We've got to get somebody white singing this. Mm-hmm. And this is, of course, how we got the Pat Boone covers, and probably unintentionally in the same way that Elvis covered, because Elvis actually liked black music and he hung around a lot of black artists. But yeah, the Pat Boone stuff just reeks of industry plant, reeks of industry going, hey, give this white man a black song and try and make it a hit. And yeesh.
Oh, so bad. So bad. To your point about Elvis, Buddy Holly had the same issue. But because before it was Buddy Holly and the Crickets, it was just the Crickets. And they had been invited to perform at the Apollo in New York. And they get there, and the guys backstage are asking who they are. And they said, we're Buddy Holly and the Crickets. They're like, you can't be the Crickets. The Crickets are black. And so they'd only ever heard them on the radio and just assumed they were black when they went out and tore the house down in front of an audience that could have booed them off stage. But to your point, you either feel the music and you know how to play and you've got a heart for it, or you're just a corporate shill like Pat Boone was. So,
yeah, I mean, I remember the first time I heard the Righteous Brothers, and I was like, okay. And then I saw them, and I was like, wait, they're not black?
Same.
They sound black. Righteous Brothers makes me think black. But all right.
Same, actually, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. First time I heard Love and Feeling, I was just like, yeah, this is definitely sounds like a song from that era. And then, like I said, when you see these guys, totally different than what you expect.
Yeah, for sure.
It's kind of like seeing Action Bronson for a more recent reference for people out there that don't know who the Righteous Brothers are. But it's kind of like seeing Action Bronson for the first time. You hear his music, and he's like, yeah, this guy sounds kind of like Ghostface Killer. And then you see him, and it's like, oh, it's not what I expected at all.
Yeah. Oh, dude. Yeah. So true. Well said. Yeah, for sure. And we were speaking about albums, kids. We said it earlier, and Phil alluded to it as well. Just take a moment to appreciate Richard's first album. Okay. Tutti Frutti. I'm just going to name the songs you probably know. Tutti Frutti, Ready Teddy, Slippin' and Slidin', Long Tall Sally, Rip It Up, Jenny Jenny, and She's Got It. On the first album, Phil, that is the first out the gate in 57, out the gate.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you got to give him his credit for like the amount of hits he came out the door with, how innovative he was with his sound. Because, I mean, just the fact that nobody was really playing piano like him. No one was singing like him. No one was really doing performances like him either. He really changed the face of music, not just rock music, but I just feel like he changed the face of music in a lot of ways.
He did. The follow-up album, Keep It Knockin', Send Me Some Lovin', Heebie Jeebies, Good Golly Miss Molly, Babyface, Ooh My Soul, The Girl Can't Help It, and Lucille on the following album. I mean, it's mind-blowing. And look, people get real hung up, Phil, on this. He was the first one to do this. There is no first in rock and roll. You can make arguments for people that you really, really love. But the truth is there's no real first, because whatever that you think that person did first, someone else did it before them differently, because everyone borrowed from everyone else. Keep It Knockin' was not, that song had already been around. Tutti Frutti had already been around. These songs Richard didn't write these songs. These songs existed, but no one, now, had anyone ever put the style and pizzazz and flash that Richard did? No, they had not. Now, people did it after him, like we said earlier, but in my mind, Phil, there's no real first anything. It's just, who was the guy that made it work? Who was the one that, I mean, Folsom Prison Blues wasn't written by Johnny Cash, kids. Spoiler alert. That was written by a woman, and it was not about being in prison. But Johnny loved the song, so he adapted it and changed it and made it his own. Does that mean he's a bad guy or a fiend? Not necessarily. It's just, he made it work. Richard took songs that had already kind of floated around out there, and he put his spin on them and his flash and his style and his substance and made them work. So what do you think about, what should we call him, dude? Because we call James Brown the godfather of soul. Elvis is, for better or worse, known as the king of rock and roll. I mean, what's Little Richard? I mean, I don't know. What do you think we should call this guy?
I mean, I know he would consider himself the real king of rock and roll.
Yes.
And he would say that, kind of like a now unemployed wrestler. But yeah, I think he has as much claim to the title of the king of rock and roll as anybody. I mean, considering how much he innovated, considering how many people worshipped at the altar of this guy by the end of his career. Yeah, he has every right to that claim. And I mean, I get what you mean about, when you get into the arguments about who came first, but it's kind of a different distinction when you have black artists that were being completely erased from history for some
For
people.
sure. Yeah.
And so I do think for some of them, it is important for them to let people know that I did this first and, I innovated and I did this and I was a pioneer in this space because a lot of people don't know that. And that's not unintentional.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. And plus there were some black artists that, how many people know the name Louis Jordan? How many people know the name Bill Wright? How many people know those names today? And some of those songs were covered by other black artists who, like Richard, made them work. And in some cases, like we've said, white artists who covered them and made them work. But again, dude, I fear sometimes the history of all this is going to get lost. I hope not. I hope there's enough people out there that care enough to keep this recorded and to keep reminding people. Like the Little Richard documentary is fantastic. If for no other reason, it's a time capsule of what this guy accomplished, and it's so well done. It deserves all the awards. I'm sure it's won some.
Yeah.
But I hope these documentaries need to continue, Phil, not just the biopics. Biopics can get it wrong. If you've seen the Queen movie, kids, you know what we're talking about. So,
yeah. Well, biopics are meant to entertain first on a lot of points. And so, the whole education and getting all the facts right stuff sometimes gets left on the back burner. And I understand, adapting things to movies and TV shows, there's a lot of tap dancing you have to do. There's a lot of towing the line you have to do between how much information to put in and how entertaining and how compelling a story is. So I get that, but I do think a lot of times documentaries are better because documentaries just want to educate. The sole purpose of a documentary most of the time is just to give you all of the information, all of the facts. So yeah, I think this biopic is very good. I think a part of what makes it good is just the sheer amount of artists that he was around when he was coming up. It lets you know all of his influences. It lets you know all the people that he influenced. It lets you know all of his peers. I mean, they make sure to let you know about Ike Turner's place in his career. And I think that's important because people see Ike Turner in one way, and that's unfortunate. Now, that is somewhat his fault as well. But he was a lot more than just, the guy that was with Tina and had a toxic relationship with her and everything he had with their act. No, he is one of the forefathers of rock and roll. He was the guy that he was a part of the first rock record that was ever produced.
He was Rocket 88.
Yeah, and that's important, man. That's important to the history of rock music. I'm sure some people will be like, oh, well, problematic this, problematic that. There are a lot of problematic people that still have their place in history. That's just how it is.
Yeah, and the song that Phil's referring to, recorded in March of 1951, released in April of 1951. And yes, that's pre-Elvis, kids.
Yep. I believe that's pre-Chuck Berry as well, because Chuck Berry is often credited as the first person to record a rock record. But I believe Rocket 88 came first.
And again, Phil, Chuck Berry borrowed from other people as well. And back then, dude, as the music industry developed and got bigger, then yes, song royalties came into play. You had more of a case. You could take people to court or whatever, and you could do it, and no one could argue. It's like, oh, well, he's right. You have to pay up. But, did you have to pay black artists? No, because they were black artists, which is absolutely ridiculous. But yeah, they were robbed constantly.
Yeah, I mean, we were still at that time period dealing with black people not having just regular rights, let alone rights as an artist.
Right.
You still had us fighting for the right to be able to go and eat in the same restaurant as white people, or go to the same bathroom, or drink at the same fountain, or something like that, or even go to the same schools. So, rights as an artist, rights for creatives, that's a completely different story.
Mm-hmm. Rocket 88 predates Chuck Berry by 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
But yeah, they made a point to point out in the documentary how he got his playing style from Rocket 88. and how influential that was on his music moving forward. Of course, they mentioned Chuck Berry in this as well. And I think that's important because, when they do get to the portion when they're talking about the inaugural class of Hall of Fame inductees and like the main five, the core five, if you will, Richard does belong in those five guys. Not just Chuck Berry, but also other guys that were pioneers. He earned his spot among those guys.
Oh, 100%. He was on his way to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and had a car accident the same night.
Yeah, what a terrible twist of fate, considering how you always hear this guy talk about how he didn't get his flowers at some point, how he was not appreciated, how much he had to prove himself, how much it was stolen from him. And for that to happen is just like cruel fate.
It really was. Yeah, dude, it wasn't until was that the American Music Awards when he was in his 60s that he finally got recognized on stage, I think.
Yeah, I think that was 1997? Something like that?
97, I think you're right, yeah. Jeez. Yeah, it took long enough, my God. Yeah, did you watch that bit of the documentary when he was on stage and accepted?
Yes, and he was crying. And
I cried like a girl. I'm telling you, dude, I got so emotional. I'm like, oh my God. Then they interviewed, I forget who they interviewed, that he watched the replay and he was crying. I'm like, oh my God, you guys are killing me. So.
Tom Clark 6M Podcast is sponsored in part by Radius Law Group. Every day, Radius helps individuals, families, small businesses, and nonprofit organizations throughout North Carolina, Florida, and Pennsylvania resolve their legal issues by providing effective legal counsel in the areas of estate planning, as well as elder law and Medicaid. Radius Law holds the radical belief that working with a lawyer can indeed be enjoyable. So give them a call at 1-800-519-5667 for more information and tell them that Tom Clark 6M Podcast sent you.
Just to see, man, that finally he was being publicly recognized after years of reminding people, not so subtly, without me, none of y'all have this, which is very much true.
Yeah, it was a very good moment for him. I know a lot of these things, when we go back and look at these guys' careers, you have to drag up all the seedy stuff. You have to drag up all of the stuff like his sexual escapades, the drugs and everything. But I was glad that he did get that moment before he passed. I'm glad that he, of course, passed in the 2000s, I believe. 2000.
He died in 2007, I think. Oh, no, 2020. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, he lived another almost another 20 years after that.
Mm-hmm.
So he lived about 13 years after 1997. And he got to get a lot of appreciation he deserves. And so I was glad for that, man. I was glad that the documentary ended on that note because a lot of these stories do not end that way.
Yeah, dude, he could have died broke and alone. And I mean, dude, I think Richard outlived all of them, didn't he?
He did. He outlived Chuck Berry. He outlived Elvis.
He outlived Cash too. Cash was gone by 2020.
Yeah, I think that he did. Of course, Jerry Lee is. When did Jerry Lee pass away?
Jerry Lee died. Oh, I take it back. Jerry Lee died last year.
There you go.
2022.
Again, when I was saying, problematic people have their place in history, almost all of these guys we named are problematic in some way. Chuck Berry's problematic for certain reasons. Jerry Lee is also problematic for certain reasons.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, that time period, man, that's just what it is.
It's kind of like if you're going to be a rock and roll guy, Phil, you got to have something. You can't just be white meat babyface. Like there's got to be something. Doesn't mean you're evil, but there's something there, right? I mean,
is there such thing as a squeaky clean rock star? I don't think there's.
There's one, and I don't know if you can call him. Well, there may be more than one. I'm exaggerating. I've never heard or read a negative word on Fats Domino. His peers never had anything bad to say. People he worked with. No one in his family, everyone loved Fats Domino. Supposedly he was very gracious and kind, respectful towards people, a great guy on stage and off stage, made time for his fans. So yeah, he may be the exception actually.
Yeah, maybe. I'm sure there's more than one, but you don't hear it very often. It's very rare.
It's true. It's true. Do you think that we look at Little Richard now on the Mount Rushmore of rock legends? Do you think he's up there now as a whole? Do we see him that way?
He should be on there. If people don't hold him to that esteem, he should be on there. Just in terms of a lot of the guys that he influenced, I mean, put it to you this way. I guarantee you a lot of guys that other people would put on there above him probably see Little Richard in that esteem.
His peers do. Yeah, that's well said. Yeah. I mean, you know, once you get the respect of your peers, everything else kind of falls in line. That's not, maybe doesn't always work that way, but a lot of times it does. Like, you know, during the course of that documentary, they mentioned David Bowie, who basically went to Niles Rodgers and said, I want to make this, my new album sound like this. And he showed him a picture of Little Richard. So the whole vibe of Let's Dance was, you know, more R&B, more funk, more, you know, he didn't want to just make it pop music. He wanted to have flash and he wanted to have heart to it because he was a huge Little Richard fan, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, you could see the influence that it had on the UK for sure. Like, I mean, in the documentary, they're talking about how, you know, before him, a lot of British rock bands and rock stars, it was just stiff. It was static. Everybody stood still. And I just can't imagine somebody like Bowie, who in his own right is a pioneer and a provocateur and all these other things. I just can't imagine going and seeing David Bowie and he's just like standing still with like a black suit on, just singing into a stationary microphone. It just sounds crazy. Like, I mean, Elton John the same way. I mean, what that ended up doing for the Beatles, of course, what I just described is what the Beatles started with. They were very stationary, black suit. But also, when you look at Paul McCartney's singing style, it's very much influenced by Little Richard.
Oh, man. What white guy was hitting the notes like Little Richard other than Paul McCartney at the time? I can't think of anybody.
Paul definitely liked his scream songs. Like, he liked his he can add two or three settings. He had his he had his ballads, and then he had like his rocker like scream music that he liked to do, whether that be Helter Skelter or I'm sure there's tons of other stuff where he'd come in and he liked to howl and scream, and he got that off from Little Richard.
He did, yeah. God, Richard's tone, his cadence, the way he just absolutely controlled the stage and you couldn't take your eyes off of him. I mean, my goodness. Dude, we've mentioned the homosexuality thing here a little bit. Do you think that this sounds like it's wrong to begin with, which I don't mean to make it sound that way. Because it's all in what you believe, kids, whatever. Who am I to judge? Either way. But do you think it benefits his legacy that we are as a society where we are now on homosexuality, where it's not as, oh, if you do that, you're going to go to hell kind of mentality as it used to be prevalent in this country? You think it bodes better for his legacy because we're now of that mindset?
I think it does. I think his legacy has aged a lot better because you have so many other publicly outed, well, I shouldn't say outed because that makes it seem like it wasn't their choice to be out, openly gay artists. And so I do think that helps his legacy in a lot of ways. But I think the thing that helps him a lot is that regardless if he was gay or straight, his music stood the test of time. Like he as a character stood the test of time. Like, I don't care when you see him, like, it's hard to not see this guy and not laugh at him because he's just a character, man.
Yeah. Yeah, no kidding. It's funny how things work because, you know, we were talking about Jerry Lee Lewis. You know, Ric Flair infamously got the woo from Jerry Lee Lewis. He always credited Jerry Lee Lewis as the guy that he got that from and that he uses it to this day. And, you know, if you go back and do the math, like, let's see, when Jerry Lee first hit, we're talking 56, okay? I mean, Richard predates Jerry Lee. You could argue that, did Jerry Lee do the woo on his own, or did he get that from Richard? So where did the woo really come from, Phil?
That's the question, isn't it? I'm sure Jerry Lee fans will say it was Jerry Lee, but I don't know. I don't have the timetable in front of me, but wouldn't be surprised if Little Richard did it first.
Yeah. I mean, because Richard began at age 14 in 1947, for goodness sake. Jerry Lee began in 49, so it's close. It's close. But Richard, hit some notoriety, I think, before Jerry Lee did. So yeah, I guess you could argue that. The James Brown connection is very funny to me. Not funny, but funny as in, oh my God, I don't think I knew that. Little known fact, kids, if you may not know, is that basically when Little Richard said he discovered James Brown, he wasn't lying, because Richard's got these tour dates scheduled and he's on the road. He's making nothing, but he's a performer. He's singing, he's traveling, and he records Tutti Frutti. It absolutely explodes. So he has to cancel these tour dates because now he's going to go promote this record and, make some money here, hopefully. Well, Richard didn't like to cancel tour dates. So he recruited this singer who was on his way up. Very good voice, great stage presence. He was working on it. He got Brown to take his spot as Little Richard on these shows because, at the time, how many people knew what Little Richard actually looked like, right? So when the guy would introduce James on the stage, he would say, the hardest working man in show business, Little Richard. Well, when James kept on his career, he loved the way that sounded. It stuck, and he kept using it until the day he died. So that's pretty cool.
That's pretty cool. I knew that they toured together. I did not know that story. That again, just a sign of the times, man.
Yeah,
a sign of the times, man. You just wouldn't be able to get away with that today,
right? Yeah, yeah. No kidding. Like you just, that's pretty good. Yeah, try that these days, kids. I got to shout out another podcast, which I don't do a whole lot here, but this podcast deserves it. Kids, go out of your way to follow and listen to A History of Rock Music in 500 Songs. It's excellent. It's a very, very good show. I think you'll love it. And of course, the goal is to get to number 500. It's very cool pod. But he does a lot of great work, deep dives, does all the legwork if you don't have the time or resources to do it, but you've always been curious about the history of rock and roll and about where these songs came from and who recorded them first and learn more about the artists. So I encourage you to go check it out. Very good show. Again, man, I fear sometimes, man, that some of this stuff's going to be lost. But, buddy, I hope not. Andrew Hickey, by the way, is the guy behind this show. So it's very well done. Everybody go check it out. Hopefully not. I think hopefully we're at this time. And, if nothing else, Phil, we're at this time of, all this information available at your fingertips. If you want to know anything about Little Richard, it's a 3-second Google search, and you've got all these websites proclaiming his greatness, which he deserves, and reminding people that he didn't get a lot of it when he was here, which is absolutely crazy. So hopefully we will never lose our connection with this guy, man.
Yeah, for sure. I do think it's a shame that when the music was coming out, he didn't get what he deserved, and he had to fight for so long to get his credit. He had to fight and probably got cheated out of millions of dollars that he should have made. But, regardless, his impact on not just American music, but rock music worldwide cannot be understated.
Oh, dude, for sure. Yeah, without him, there's so much stuff that doesn't come afterward. There's also a train of thought here, Phil, that you could say if he had not left the business the times that he did, if he had stayed, what else could he have done in the times that he left? But man, he was very much, I don't know if I want to call him a victim. That may not be fair to him. But he was very much a product of his time, in as much as we said, he was born and raised in church, raised and taught certain things. And, he's struggling with his own identity, I would believe, for most of his life. And so he decides to absolutely leave the business, leaves it behind more than one time here, to focus on working in the church and doing those things, man. It makes you wonder, had he not left during those times, had he stayed? I don't know, dude. Maybe leaving was good for him to some degree because it helped keep him from destroying himself, because drugs were involved. I mean, it's not like he was clean as a whistle. He wasn't. Yeah. So maybe it was a good thing that he got away during the times that he did, right?
Yeah, it seems like when they talked about that part of his life in the documentary and his closeness to God and just his time away and going to school and studying, it seemed to ground him in some ways, as much as you can ground a guy like that. It seemed like it grounded him in some ways. It seemed like he had some structure in his life for a little bit before he went back to touring. Yeah, which that story in the documentary is really, really great as well, when they talk about how his opening act wasn't sure what he was going to do when he came out. Nobody knew the songs he was going to play because he had been gone and he had been doing gospel music. And the whole time they're just looking around like, what is this guy going to do? And so he's introduced on stage and he's not standing out there. And then he just like hops from the rafters with this cape on.
It's a great story. That's when they were in England, right?
Yes. That was like right before he started doing the whole European tour. That's right before the Hamburg stuff with the Beatles. Yeah, great story. It just shows just like he just had it in him. He was a performer, man. I can't see him living life and not being this guy that was on stage and being able to perform and make people feel good.
Yeah, dude, we got to give him some credit. I'm glad you mentioned the Hamburg connection with the Beatles. I mean, that part of the Beatles story is well known, that they earned their chops and they became a real band during all those nights in a row playing in Germany in front of nobody, getting paid nothing, and took uppers constantly because they had to do shows all night long, every night of the week.
Two Nations Under Ted, a Ted Lasso podcast, tackles one of the most popular and critically acclaimed series of our time, bringing together three hosts from two different parts of the world. Two Nations reviews all 3 seasons of Ted Lasso, 34 episodes total, with wrap-up episodes coming at the end of each season. Follow the show on social media at Two Nations Pod, and be sure to subscribe and download on all the major platforms. Just look us up, Two Nations Podcast.
That's where they met Richard, and Richard spoke highly of them and thought highly of them. And, of course, they were enamored with him and had always been fans. So, like, there's something to be said, man, of the number of guys that Richard touched during his career, dude.
Yeah. I that's why I'm saying I think it says a lot about, like, that era of rock and just how all of those guys studied at the altar of not just Richard, but, like, guys like Muddy Waters and, like, blues musicians and all of these guys that, you know, created the foundation for what rock music would be.
Yeah, 100%. And as we said earlier, the British guys had a lot to do with, you know, certain revivals at different times. Like, they loved Richard, they loved Chuck Berry, they loved Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, they loved a lot of these guys, man. I mean, dude, without the American blues played by black men in this country, you don't get Led Zeppelin, you don't get Eric Clapton, you don't get Cream, you don't get Hendrix. Hendrix, well, you know what I mean. Hendrix struck gold in England before he got big here, but he had to go there to make it happen, which is ridiculous. But, you know, it's amazing how, and again, dude, I think it's all about peers' respect. When you get the respect of your peers, and musicians know what good musicianship sounds like because they know, then of course it's going to be, you know, let's help this person. It's like we mentioned David Bowie before, like Stevie Ray Vaughan doesn't get on that album unless David Bowie's a fan of Stevie Ray Vaughan. And Stevie Ray was going through a bad time and needed the work. And Bowie's like, I love this guy. Let's put him on the album. I want to work with him. So he put Stevie back into motion and really helped give him another bite at the table, I suppose you could say. So I think it's about people helping people here for sure. Do you think Richard has an easier time now versus growing up and being big when he was? Probably in some ways. I'm sure some of that stuff stays with you. I'm sure some of that insecurity and some of those some of that need to prove himself stayed with him for most of his life. But you know, I would like to hope by the end he was at peace with a lot of those struggles. He seemed I don't know if you caught that part of the documentary, in his last couple of years, unrecognizable. Yeah. Man, that was hard to watch. Like, he'd stop wearing the wigs and he'd stop, you know, the joke with Richard was that he spent his life wearing Pancake 31, which was, he was introduced to it, I think, by Bill Wright, I believe, I could be wrong, to wear on stage, and he never stopped wearing it. He thought it was great. Yeah, every time you seen him, his face was beat. He had that makeup. Had that makeup caked on. But that was Richard. Like, that was part of his style. The pencil mustache, like the eyeliner, everything, the big hair.
it's just a part of who he was, a part of the appeal. It did seem unrecognizable by the end, but time is undefeated, man.
Yeah, that's true.
Time will catch up with all of us, and doesn't matter who you are and what you've done in life. At some point, you're still going to be, who you were when you first got here. And I think a lot of ways, seeing him stripped down in that way was sad, but it also doesn't change what he did for music and who he was.
I think he was at peace. He seemed to be okay. He seemed to be like he had finally reached a good place. Like, as peaceful as you can be if you feel as though the end is coming. But yeah, oof. God, man, he lived through a long time. He was 87 when he died. So he lived a good long life. And I would hope by the end he understood. I would hope by the end that he felt as though not only was he at peace, but he could feel love of people around him, because he was definitely loved, man. I mean, honestly, I think the Little Richard that a lot of people are going to remember is the 1980s Little Richard. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like when he wasn't like pencil thin, wearing the oversized suits and in the black and white footage. Like people still see those clips. But for them, the 1980s Little Richard, when he kind of had sort of the same sort of outfit on all the time, the same sparkly outfit, the same hair all the time, it kind of became his signature look in the 80s, man. So that might be the Richard that people think of, the one they remember. But for me, it'll be a combination of that and a combination of the old clips of him playing as well. Again, dude, just one of a kind. Just one of a kind. The music business is so much better off with him having been here, which is a testament to the guy's talent, man.
For sure. I think you're right. I mean, I think some people, their memories of James Brown will be James Brown, like late 80s, early 90s, and just like some of his fiascos, then some of his appearances. Like, how many times have we seen that CNN interview pop up now?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure some people will remember him for that more than the music, or some of his performances, because they weren't here, they didn't see it. And I think in some ways that's the thing with Richard. If you weren't here for him in his heyday, or the performances and the albums and everything that put him on the map, I think most of us only know him from doing big appearances, making cameos, doing interviews and stuff, showing up and accepting like lifetime achievement type awards and stuff like that. So that's all you know him as. It's crazy to think of it, but that's just what it is.
I mean, 20, 30 years from now, they may be talking about stars of this era in the same vein, like, which is mind blowing. But dude, like you said, no one beats time. Time moves on, man. Keeps marching.
Yeah, for sure. But I think that the great thing about now as well is that because of the internet, you can just go and look up tons of things that you might not have seen. I think the great thing about discovering music now as opposed to discovering music, let's say 20 years ago, is that you can go and discover music, and you can go and see tons of like live performances and stuff from the 60s and 70s for some of these artists that if you weren't here, it isn't the same thing as being in a room, but you also can see like a time capsule of what made them great.
Yeah, it's good way to put it. Good call. Like you said, being able to look up the history of it. And if you've got any questions, kids, I'm telling you, YouTube's a great platform. I highly endorse YouTube. Because, you find everything you want to find there, man. I mean, you find the guy's whole career, basically. There's just a wealth of material out there to choose from, man. We did mention Bill Wright. We failed to mention Escarita. Escarita was a performer. And there again, if you look at pictures of Escarita, you're going to say, he kind of looks like Little Richard. Well, Little Richard kind of looks like him. Because again, it's not about not necessarily who came first, but who made it work, who took all the elements to make it click, and make it work. We're not talking about stealing music. That's something else altogether. But taking elements and making it click and making it work. I mean, he had his inspirations. Every artist every artist has their inspiration. I don't care who you are, what music genre you're in, you have inspiration. Like I saw a clip of Ozzy Osbourne, this was several years ago, meeting Paul McCartney for the first time. Ozzy thought he was going to cry. He's like, you inspired me so much growing up. And if you're Paul, you're thinking, I inspired Ozzy Osbourne. But Ozzy was being very real with him. It was a very cool thing to see. So like, it doesn't matter who you are, kids, you're inspired by somebody. So I'm glad that Richard at least got some semblance of respect when he was here, and hopefully it will always continue. I mean, rock and roll is not the same without him, right? I mean, you could argue the case for all what we call the forefathers of the genre here, but I mean, his brand of rock and roll, the fire and the personality and the charisma and the stage presence. I mean, as we said earlier, Phil, without him, maybe none of that happens. It's crazy to think that without that one guy bringing all those things together and making them work, maybe we don't have half of the great music that came afterward. Is mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, I mean, not just that we don't have half of the great music. We don't have half of the live experiences that happened after that. Like when you just think of all of the guys that, got on that stage and decided, I mean, just like he, I don't remember who he gave the advice. He's like, oh, you don't have to stand still. You could just use the whole stage. And when you just think of all of these guys that, got in front of a crowd on a stage and, changed somebody's life, it's partially because Little Richard changed somebody's life before that. Yeah,
crazy. And again, everybody affects everyone else. Like everyone affects everyone else. Like without the old blues men, without Louis Jordan, without, Sister Rosetta Thorpe, without a lot of these like blues and soul musicians, you don't get Little Richard, you don't get James Brown. Well, without James Brown, Little Richard, and, a few other guys, you don't get a lot of, R&B and hip hop. No hip hop. Without James Brown, forget about it. Like, and dude, everything just kind of works hand in hand, right? I mean, yeah, nothing wrong with that. It's just how it all plays out.
Yeah.
Man, we've covered Cash here. We've talked about Elvis, but we've never really covered him. We've talked about Ray Charles here, who we didn't mention really during this, but yeah, but I'm glad we got Little Richard covered as well. So that's pretty cool. And man, his song, I got to say this before we wrap it up. His recording sounds so crisp and so clean, and like the stripped down old school rock and roll where the drum, you can really only hear like the kick drum. That's all you can hear. Like that to me is rock and roll, man, where the guitar's not overpowering. If there's any guitar, a lot of Richard's stuff was horns and a stand-up bass, the double bass, which sounds phenomenal. And then that snare drum in the background, that's just great stuff, man. Like his recordings, if you haven't listened to them in a while, sound so good, man. And his voice just takes center stage. I love that his voice isn't covered up or overpowered by the music. He left behind quite a career and quite a collection of music to listen to, man. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a blessing to leave that kind of mark on the world, man. To leave that kind of mark on so many people. To leave that kind of mark on a genre, man. Not just anybody manages to do that.
Very true. Very true. Just think, kids, if you're listening to this, you may not have lived during the time of Little Richard, but if you did, count yourself lucky that you lived through some of it anyway, that he shared the same planet as a genius like Little Richard. Some of that stuff's not lost on me, guys that I've, have been around during my time. And yeah, that's pretty cool. Pretty cool to think about. Well, kids, there you have it. There's Little Richard. In the matter of an hour, we summed up the guy's entire career. There's nothing more that needs to be said. We're all done. I'm kidding. There's a lot more that could be said. A lot more you should check into. By all means, go check out Little Richard, I Am Everything. That's a documentary we've been watching. We've been referencing here. If you want to go check out the biopic featuring Leon that's straight to TV, hey, look, it's your time. You want to go spend your time watching that, it's fine.
Yeah, I would say watch the Temptation movie instead because it's a much better movie starring Leon. And his portrayal of David Ruffin is much better, even though it's controversial in some ways as well. His family of David Ruffin did not agree with this portrayal. That is very clear after the making of this movie. But yeah, I wouldn't rush to see this Little Richard movie if you don't.
You couldn't have just let the guy have the Ruffin portrayal, just leave it at that. You had to put that on there.
Yeah, I don't know, man. Oof.
Yeah, he didn't come off like the best guy in that film, buddy. He was Yeah. Self-centered, self-absorbed, egotistical. It's all about me. I'm like, all right, well.
I'm sure that parts of that was true, but I think when you do biopics, you have to skate the line between showing somebody flaws and showing what makes them great.
Good call. Good call. All right, kids, there you have it. There's Little Richard. Let's try to put a button on this. Phil, give me your last word on Little Richard.
Yeah, once in a lifetime artist, a pioneer, an innovator, a guy that dared to be different at a time where there were not just no black artists doing what he was doing, but no homosexual artists doing what he was doing. He just, I don't know, changed music for the better. And I mean, he may overstate that as many times he had a chance, but I think there's something so empowering about a guy that had to prove so much coming into the industry and growing up to get to the point where he was, and was like, now I'm even bigger than what I was, because now I have the right to lie. And it's something so empowering and amazing about that even that part of his career, I think, is just incredible, man.
100%. And if you've learned nothing from this show, kids, number one, Little Richard, his legend will never die. You can call him whatever you want to call him. King, Godfather, I don't care. The guy is a phenomenon. Maybe that's the best word. The fact that he existed when he did, he had the career that he had, and fought against the odds, fought against a few different things to be successful. Amazing, the career the guy had. That's your first takeaway. Number two, down with Pat Boone, okay? Pat Boone is the anti-Richard. Don't forget that. Hey, look, all due respect to the dearly departed, but I know a sham when I see one. I know a work when I see one. I've watched enough pro wrestling. That guy was definitely a work, okay? All right, kids, there you have it. There's Little Richard here on the 6M. There'll be more musical geniuses to come. We've just barely scraped the top of the iceberg with the Music M part of this show, so stay tuned for that, and we appreciate it. In the meantime, that is Little Richard.
Hey, thanks for listening to the show. Check out our social media on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at 6M Podcast. We'll see you next time.